even after they were able to bring in another CEO or someone else to come in and take over the business, it never really recovered. As a matter of fact, one of the statistics that you gave in the studies found that the negative effect on sales when the entrepreneur dies is a 60% reduction in sales. And not only is it's not just a short reduction, it is a persistent reduction. That seems significant to me as an entrepreneur myself. What did you guys think when you uncovered that?
Yeah, we obviously we tortured the data to see whether that's really right or whether we somehow miscalculated stuff. But that's simply what it is. So all that suggests that founders are really a key to the firm's DNA, and they are not easily replaceable, at least when they are taken out of business at a sudden, out of surprise. Yeah.
In today's ultra-competitive business world, being a successful entrepreneur or business owner can be very challenging. Fortunately, contemporary times have blessed us with resources for tackling those challenges and getting us to success more quickly than we could have imagined. Welcome to The Root of All Success with the real Jason Duncan, a podcast that explores how the world's most powerful entrepreneurs grow incredible companies. This podcast looks at the 5 keys to unlocking success as an entrepreneur. A successful educator turned entrepreneur, Jason's mission is to use his gifts of teaching and leadership to help others get the results they want out of life. Join Jason every week and learn the keys to grow a truly successful business.
Welcome back to a very special edition of The Root of All Success. I'm the real Jason Duncan. Today's guest is not an entrepreneur. He's not a celebrity. He's not an athlete. He's not a musician. He's not an artist. He's an economist, and he's a professor, and he's a researcher. And you're probably going, well, why is he on the show? That's not what you do, Jason. That's not who you talk to. Well, you're going to see really quickly why I decided to invite this guy on my show. As a matter of fact, when I reached out to him, he got back to me and said, well, I've listened to your show and you never have educators on your show. Why would you want me on the show? And I had to explain. But let me tell you a little bit about that in a moment. But first of all, before I get in there, I want to say thank you for tuning in. I'm recording this from my home studio here in Gallatin, Tennessee, just north of Nashville. And our guest is hailing all the way from Melbourne, Australia. And he's at his home there. And I'm recording this intro after we've recorded the episode. And we were having significant technical difficulties during the recording. And if anything's not 100% crystal clear, please accept my apologies. But for those of you that listen via your podcast player, thank you for doing so. Please go leave us a review. Give us a 5-star if you think we deserve it. And make sure you subscribe so that you're notified each time I put out a new episode, which I release every week. I think Tuesday morning is when we release them. But thank you for tuning in. And if you're watching on YouTube, hey there, glad to see you. Thank you for tuning in. And I'm glad that you subscribe to this channel. It's the youtube.com/TheRealJasonDuncan if you want to go check it out. So let me get back to why I invited Dr. Sascha Becker onto the show today. So just not too long ago, one of my business coaches and I were talking about the concept of exit without exiting and what the appeal was and why people would want to do it. And we stumbled across a study called Entrepreneur Death and Startup Performance. And the study was led by Dr. Sascha Becker and then also Hans Vide. And I don't know if I'm saying that name right. I think I mispronounced it in the show. But they did a study, and we're going to talk all about that study, about what happens after two startups after the founder's death, whether it was planned or unplanned. And when I read that study, I was firmly convinced that I needed to have this guy who did the study on the show to talk about what that means to entrepreneurs who are building companies today. So without any further ado, let me introduce to you, kind of give you some background on Dr. Sascha Becker. He is the Xiaokai Chair of Business and Economics at Monash University in Melbourne. He's the part-time professor at the University of Warwick, England. He has previously held positions at Ludwig-Maximilians-University in Munich and at the University of Stirling in Scotland. So he is no slouch whatsoever. He studied economics at the University of Bonn in Germany and at a very long-named university in France that I cannot pronounce. So my apologies to the ENSAE in Paris and to Dr. Becker for not being able to say all those French words. He obtained his Ph.D. at the European University Institute in Florence in 2001. In the spring of 2000, he was a visiting scholar at the Center for Labor Economics at the University of California in Berkeley. And in 2006, he spent 7 months at the University of California in San Diego. In 2014, 15, and 18, he was a visiting professor at UCLA Anderson School of Management. And his research has appeared in many international journals, including the Review of Finance, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and the American Economic Review. And I want you to help me welcome a little bit different outside the box guest today, but I think we'll play into exactly what we talk about a lot, about how to get to success and make sure that your company thrives, even in your absence, because I'm the exit guy, the exit lifestyle, exit without exiting. Help me welcome Dr. Sascha Becker to the show. Well, Sasha, thank you for being here on this show. This is going to be an interesting one, and I've probably been looking forward to this show more than most, only because you're such an out-of-the-box guest for the show. You're not an entrepreneur, you're not the typical person on the show, but there's a very specific reason, as I indicated in the intro, why you're here. But thank you so much for doing the show with me today.
Hi, Jason. Good to be here.
Where in the world are you? Everybody's going to recognize pretty quickly that your accent means you don't live in Nashville, Tennessee. So where are you?
I'm based in Melbourne, Australia, and it's now Saturday morning, my side, or it's Friday afternoon, your side.
All right. So Melbourne, Australia. So how are things there now? How's that going?
Good. Omicron is more or less over. We are in the middle of summer. And it's good to be here.
Good. Well, so let's start off with your background. So tell everybody a little bit about your background, because as I said, you're not the typical guest, you're not an entrepreneur, but you've got a very unique background based in education and research. So tell us a little bit about your background.
So I'm an economist by training, and I studied in Germany and in France, and then did my doctorate in Italy. So I've been in a few European countries. I also stayed a few times in the US. And in terms of research interests I do a lot of economic history, but also I work on labor markets. I look into things like labor market discrimination. Why is it that some people get a job interview and others don't? And then I work on entrepreneurship, and that's, I guess, why I'm here for today.
So you did a study, and this is really going to be the main part of what we're going to talk about today, is that you did a study called Entrepreneur Death and Startup Performance. And you did that with someone else, Hans Havide. Am I saying the last name correctly? Vida. Okay. So American mispronouncing a name. So you did this study and you looked at 75,000 firms in the country of Norway, and you saw that there were 1,500 founder deaths across those 75,000 firms over a 15-year period, and you studied that. And I want to set the stage for why I want to ask you some of these questions. And I told you, pre-show and we're getting ready, the reason I reached out to you originally is that with one of my business coaches, we were talking about what I do as a business coach and a public speaker is I train entrepreneurs on how to exit the daily operations of their business so that their business continues to thrive and they continue to thrive. They can go on and do other things. Well, with my business coach and I, one day, this has been months ago, we were just on our normal coaching call, and we were just Googling the concept, and your study popped up, and we both were peeking at it, and it was intriguing because it was a study about what happens to firms, what happens to companies when the founder unexpectedly goes away, or even expectedly goes away. So if there's a diagnosis of cancer, for example, and it's terminal, and there may be a period of time where the founder slowly fades away for the business and eventually passes away. What happens to those firms? And while I'm not necessarily coaching entrepreneurs on not to die, because I can't do that, but I am coaching them on how to prepare for that inevitable exit, whether it be through death or some other means. So that's why we're talking about this. And you did this study with your partner on what happened. Why? What originated that? Why did that even cross your mind to study that as an economist?
So the background there is that in economics, there's a long discussion over many decades now about what even is a firm. So if you go back hundreds of years, typically, whatever, people were working in agriculture, and your business was your farm, and you worked for yourself, and maybe you sold some stuff on the market, but that was it. And the whole concept of what is a firm as a legal entity, a limited liability company, or whatever it might be, all of that is developments from far later. Yeah? And once you define what a firm is or start thinking about what is a firm, you ask yourself, well, can it be thought of as being something different from the founder himself or herself? Or are they like conjoined twins? And at what point does the firm get a life of its own? And for how long is it, so to say, married and interwoven with the founder herself or himself? And so we thought, how can we get at that topic? Because, well, some founders choose to stay in the firm for long, some don't. And it's hard to tell what is the founder effect and what is the firm as a separate entity. It's a bit like mother and baby. In the first few months of the life, the baby and the mom can't do without each other, but maybe at some point the baby lives a life of its own anyway. So we then, my co-author Hans Wiede, being from Norway, in Norway they have amazing data at the statistical office that they share with researchers under certain conditions. So we're able to get access to the life of all startups in Norway, 75,000 of them. And then we figured that many of them died while the firm was still in its infancy or in the first few years of its life. And so we thought that could maybe give us insight into what happens and how important is the founder, because if the firm does badly when the founder dies, that tells us maybe that the founder is truly important to the survival of the firm.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting analogy that you draw and using the term conjoined twins. I thought that was very interesting. And then, of course, the analogy changes to mother and baby. But I think that it's really important to have those word pictures to think through this. So what I think it sounds to me like what you guys did is that there was this hypothesis or this concept that is a firm separate identity-wise from the founder. And typically, I think most people would think, no, it's probably not, because the founder is the personality and the driver of culture and everything that goes on in the business. It usually reflects the founder. And so your hypothesis, it seems like it started out with, well, is that true? And if it's true, what happens when there is a separation? When you take the conjoined twins, and again, I don't want to get too medical or descriptive, but if you separate conjoined twins, a lot of times it's not a positive outcome. And but what it should be is a mother and a baby, where the baby grows up with its own independent life. And unfortunately, so many entrepreneurs don't build their businesses as a baby. It is, as you said, a conjoined twin. So that's why you got started in this, and you used Norway as the country to study, because you had access to all those 75,000 firms that started up, where another country might be a little bit daunting to pick out through the millions of firms that might have started up. But Norway is no slouch. It's a pretty big economy. So can you explain, you remember the numbers? I mean, if you don't worry about not knowing the numbers, but do you remember how big the economy is in Norway as compared to, say, a state here in the United States?
Yeah, so Norway, let's forget about the physical size, but GDP, so income per capita, it's roughly at the level of Texas. And in terms of population, it's round about 5.5 million, which is similar to Minnesota. So it does compare to some extent to some of the US states in size and GDP.
So part of your study, I mean, you chose Norway. You've got 75,000 companies that you're looking at. 1,500 of those entrepreneurs had a death, during the first several years of the startup's existence. And so what you were able to do is to take the statistical data of the growth or the decline of that business after the death event of the founder. Is that a correct synopsis of what the study does?
Yeah, that's correct. So we were able to get data on the balance sheets that these firms have to submit to the Norwegian tax authorities. So that is the official data they have to report, and they are bound by law not to lie. So we have the numbers that are as official as it gets.
So you've got not only 75,000 firms, you also have the balance sheets of all those firms over those years. Of course, personal data redacted, so you're not looking at the type of firm or the who did what, but you're just looking at raw data. And then what you were asking is if entrepreneurs personally embed a major part of the value of the firm, and if so, it's going to be difficult to value the firm to outside investors if they are the value to the firm. I love this. You actually quoted Hart and Moore from 1994, and I'll read the quote from the actual study. It says, "If entrepreneurs personally embed a major part of the value of the firm, it will be difficult to pledge the value of the firm to outside investors, which could lead to credit constraints and underinvestment in entrepreneurial firms." And the way I understand that, Sasha, is that if the entrepreneur is 100% the conjoined twin, that not only does that harm the business in the event of his or her passing, but it also limits while they're alive, the ability to get credit, the ability to have investors come in, because the investors and the bankers are going to see, well, this business is really you, and if you pass away, there's a huge risk that we might not be able to compensate for. Is that why you wrote that into the study and quoted that?
Yeah, exactly. That's essentially what it is.
So you go on to say in that next sentence in your study, the extent to which entrepreneurs are non-substitutable is largely an unexplored question. That really is what I think struck my interest in this, is that I say this a lot. I say this a lot when I speak, is that as an employee, you should be indispensable to your employer, because that's job security. But as an entrepreneur, you should create yourself to be dispensable. And you use the term substitutable or non-substitutable, same thing, right? I think entrepreneurs should create their businesses where they are substitutable. That makes their business more valuable. And it really, frankly, protects the employees in the event of their untimely death. Because I was meeting with one of my clients just the other day, very successful entrepreneur, had a business for 20 years. They're doing millions of dollars in revenue. And he absolutely loves being at the center of everything. And he's a good dude, very good guy. And I said, it's really selfish what you're doing. And he was like, what? I said, but what happens to the company if you go away, if something happens to you? And he had not really thought about that before. And that's why we're talking about your study. So let me ask you this. So you did this study in Norway, 75,000 companies, 1,500 deaths. You did this over 15 years. So this is not a snapshot in time. How important is it as a researcher and economist to have 15 years worth of data versus a sample size much smaller than over a shorter period of time? Tell the listeners how important that time period is.
So why it is important is because we can follow all these firms from day one. Yeah? So we are not entering the game when they are all 5 years old and we don't know what happened in the 5 years before, but we have their balance sheets from the day they were founded. So we can really also see how they develop in the first years before the founder death. And I should also say that throughout, we compare the firms where a founder dies to the ones where no founder dies. So we draw inference, or we get information from this direct comparison of firms that are very similar to each other, because you might have two firms, both in IT, both with a founder of the same age, with the same education, and so on and so on. But one of them has a car accident and the other hasn't. Yeah? And that's the kind of comparison we have that allows us to say what happens when a founder dies. So being able to trace the firm's development over many years, and then also after founder death, does the firm survive itself, or does it go out of business with the founder death? we can follow the firms afterwards. And in parallel, we look at all these firms where no founder dies. And for that, we need a lot of years of data, because otherwise, maybe we observe some effect in the year after founder death, and then the study ends, so to say. But in reality, the firm bounces back. That's what we expected initially, that maybe founder death creates turbulence. The firm suddenly is in trouble because the mastermind is gone. But then once the guy gets replaced, then the firm bounces back. That could have happened, but we find that that is not the case, but that the negative effects of founder death are protracted over time.
So that is a point that I want to make. I want to make very clear, because that was one of the surprising things that we see. So you did a 15-year study. You're able to follow firms from startup all the way to 15 years of age, or their demise before the 15 years. But what you would have expected, and I think a lot of entrepreneurs probably think this too, and they put in insurance policies and key man policies and succession plans that say, well, we'll bring in someone else. But they're woefully inadequate, because as you saw in the study, that even after they were able to bring in another CEO or someone else to come in and take over the business, it never really recovered. As a matter of fact, one of the statistics that you gave in the studies found that the negative effect on sales when the entrepreneur dies is a 60% reduction in sales. And not only is it's not just a short reduction, it is a persistent reduction. That seems significant to me as an entrepreneur myself. What did you guys think when you uncovered that?
Yeah, we obviously we tortured the data to see whether that's really right or whether we somehow miscalculated stuff. But that's simply what it is. So all that suggests that founders are really the key to the firm's DNA, and they are not easily replaceable, at least when they are taken out of business at a sudden, out of surprise. Yeah.
So you quoted a study done in the U.S. in 2019 that was a similar study, but not certainly with the same data or the same longevity. But there was a study done by Smith, and there was the results in that study showed not only a 60% reduction, or not only to corroborate the 60% reduction in sales that would be persistent after death, but they say that there was a drop in profits of about 53% following the business owner death. And that was a US study. Your study showed a 36% drop in profits after the death. So I want to break that down, because that's a lot of numbers. So for the listeners, your study, Sasha, shows a 60% persistent decline in sales and a 36% decline in profit. That's significant. I mean, that's over half of the sales and over a third of the profits. And the U.S. study that you cite in your research shows that a U.S. study showed a 53% drop in profits. I can't imagine losing 53% of my profits as an entrepreneur. I don't know how they survived at all with that. Was that what you expected, or was there something different that you might have expected?
Really hard to say beforehand. I don't think I had a particular number in mind. I think I had the sense that the effects would be large, but whether it would be 60% drop in sales or 30%, I didn't really have a good guess beforehand. But that's just what it turns out to be. I should say in that US study, that is quite different in terms of sample. Yeah? We have the universe of all founders. Many of these firms may be small, right? Whereas that US study is focusing more on high value entrepreneurs, people with a turnover of 1 million a year. So that's a slightly different sample. The numbers are not perfectly comparable, but still, it's the same ballpark of estimate.
Yeah, well,
which shows it's not just that Norway is different, but these effects seem to happen in many developed economies and even in the US.
Well, even if your number is the basement number, it's the bottom line, and 53 being a lot higher than that, but at 36% drop in profits, I mean, to take out a third of every dollar brought in profitability for a company is is almost not sustainable. I think, again, this is an anecdotal that I would see as a business coach and a business owner myself, is that the only way that you could survive that is because the entrepreneur who was probably taking that third home and pay is now no longer there to take it home and pay. So the rest of the business can live on, but you can't afford to bring in somebody to take over, which may be why when the new CEO comes in after the death of the founder, that doesn't really recover because there's not enough cash to go around. Do you think that might be the case, or is there some other reason?
Well, we try to look into all these different stories, and whether it's about cash flow and all that, but it seems to be really related to the specialness of the founder. So what we also do, and maybe that's also interesting for your listeners, is since we had then some people comment on the study before we published it, who said, well, look, is it really the founder that is special, or isn't it that in a small firm, whoever dies, some key worker, not the founder, has a similar effect? So assume you have a manager installed and the manager dies, the CEO dies, doesn't that have the same effect as the founder does? So we also got hold of data on the deaths of CEOs in firms who are not founders themselves. And there the effects were substantially smaller. There is also a negative effect. So taking out any key person in a firm is a shock that the firm needs to deal with. But it seems you can replace the CEO, the manager CEO, more easily than the founder CEO.
Coming out of the study, you guys did, as researchers and economists, you did a very good study and pulled together a lot of data. Based on that anecdotal and empirical data that you got, what insights did you walk away with from the study that I think listeners would probably be interested in hearing?
Yeah. So the main finding that we already talked about, but let me restate it, is that when founders die, firm performance drops significantly. In many cases, especially among the smaller firms in our sample, these firms go out of business completely. And among the larger firms who maybe have already gained more of an independent life from the founder, because there is so many workers around already and managers and different layers of responsibility, those firms see a significant drop in firm performance. So even if they survive as a firm, they do worse. And the headline number that we have is that sales drop by 60%, and that effect is protracted over several years. But then the question is, why is that? And going back to what we discussed earlier, this discussion in economics about what even is a firm, we ask, has that to do with the entrepreneur being special, or is it just turbulence? Is it simply whenever an important person in a firm dies, the firm is struggling? So what we do is to also pull up data on firms where a manager dies, a CEO dies, who is not the founder, and see whether these effects are similar. And if they were, it would really just be that if something bad happens to a firm, the firm struggles, and it's nothing to do with the founder. But we find that in those cases, the effects are much smaller. So it seems to be that the founder is really special. Well, then another thing that maybe your listeners would find interesting, and I definitely found interesting, is we also were able to get hold of the information in the death certificates of the founders. So we can see whether a founder died surprisingly, say a car accident, a sudden death, as we call it, or whether the death might have been foreseeable. So assume someone has cancer, then the person knows that they might die in the near future. So it turns out that in cases where there is a sudden death, the effects we measure are much larger than in cases where death is somewhat foreseeable. So also that suggests that planning ahead, or being able to plan ahead, you can soften the negative effects of the departure of the founder.
So there's a lot of data there, a lot of evidence, a lot of insights. So I want to kind of break that down, if I may, and get you to make some comments, maybe based on how I interpret all of that. So what I'm seeing is that if the founder is actively working in the firm, one of the things that your study showed was that if he is actively or she is actively working in the firm and involved in day-to-day business activities, the losses are higher than if the founder is not as active. So if you're very active and you're the centerpiece of the firm and you pass away, significant losses. If you're involved but not as much, then the losses are lessened. So that was one of the things I think is very interesting, which is a lesson to entrepreneurs all over the world, is that if you want your firm to outlast you and to be a legacy and to live on in the event of your passing or your attempt or desire to move out of the firm altogether, you've got to plan for that. Which also, I think Sasha, you pointed out that when the death of the founder was expected, so I say expected maybe loosely, but when there's cancer, there's a terminal illness, and there's time to prepare for the transition, the firms suffer less loss than if it was sudden. So again, that goes back to a warning for entrepreneur founders today, is that you've got to plan for that exit. You've got to get ready now, whether you want to exit or not. Your ability, your company's ability to live beyond you is largely, almost entirely dependent upon your ability to prepare everyone for that. So, going back to my story, rather, when I talked about one of my clients who doesn't want to exit, but when I told him he was being selfish by not thinking about that, that I'm not trying to be mean. It really, there's evidence to point out the fact that it is kind of selfish if you're not preparing for that. What did you see? What did you see the difference between a family-run firm versus partners who are not related to each other? Was there any difference in the outcome after the death?
Yeah, that's also an interesting one. So what we find is that in family firms, also the negative effects of founder death are smaller than in non-family firms. So that suggests that there are more people around who probably have either the same DNA, they do by definition, or they have the same vision for the firm and who can step in when the founder dies. And that seems to soften the negative effects. Whereas if it's a partnership firm, because I should also say that not all of these entrepreneurs are 100% owners, but some of them are in an 80-20 or 50-50 relationship with another founder. So it's about these partnerships we are now talking. If it's a family member, the effects are smaller than if it's a non-family member.
Very interesting. Very interesting. But I think that your point there about them sharing the DNA, like literally, has a lot to do with that ability. But it's hard. I used to say a long time ago when I was running the day-to-day operations of one of my companies that I thought I need to clone myself. And if I could clone myself, then things could go on without me and I could move away. And your study reveals that if I had been able to do that, that might have worked. That might have worked a little better. Well, what I want to do now is kind of, as we close out our conversation on this study, is give you the opportunity to speak to an audience full of entrepreneurs. They're founders, they're running companies. Based on this long study that you and Hans did on this effective death of founders in Norway, what advice would you give? What would you say to them based on what you know now after doing the study? How should they prepare their companies?
Well, I guess what we already said a few times now is, planning ahead is important. To the extent that we used that analogy earlier on about the firm being the baby, you want your baby to survive. And if you don't prepare it for independence, then it may go down the drains with yourself. And I guess our results show that quite strongly.
You use the baby analogy quite well, and I want to kind of finish out by reiterating that myself, is that you say in the study, and when I asked you pre-show about what advice you'd give, you said, well, if you care for your firm, nobody cares for the baby like the mother, and you can't exit day one. You have to be there in the early days. You've got to show the baby how to eat and how to laugh and how to have the appropriate emotions and how to crawl and then how to walk and then eventually how to run. And at some point, you never pick your baby up again. And I don't think that we as parents think about that. There was a day when you picked your child up for the last time. You didn't think about it when you did it, but there was a time. So as entrepreneurs, we need to think about our companies in the same way, is that we need to show them, we bring them into the world, the company into the world. We show them how to eat, which is to make sales and profitability. We show them how to have the right emotions, which is how you connect with your community and with your customers and your prospects and your vendors. You show them how to crawl, which in other words, we'll be small at first. Show them how to run, and you're making millions of dollars in revenue. And eventually, if you've done it correctly, you've picked your kid up for the last time. You've set him down or her down, and they should be able to walk and go on their own. And I love that analogy, Sasha. I think that was very ingenious of you to come up with that as an analogy. And I think that entrepreneurs listening to the show today, even though this was a little bit off of center of normal shows, but this is really good stuff. I'm so glad that you had the curiosity to do the study and that you guys had such good data to go on. And I hope that this would be a warning and a cautionary tale to entrepreneurs who are holding their baby every single day. They're running around doing all the stuff, and they never let the kid down. They never let him walk on his own, never let him run on his own. You can't ever live that exit lifestyle. You can't exit without exiting until you figure out how to put the kid down. So, Sasha, this has been a phenomenal conversation. I love the data. And I would say that if anybody wants a copy of this study to read it for themselves, it's a very consumable study. I mean, I read pretty much the whole thing. I skipped over a lot of the tables, but I read the text, and I think that people could find that. Sasha, where could people connect with you online, social media, et cetera? And then how could they get a copy of this? What's the best format for that?
Well, you could share with your email list a link to the study. It's free for download. So there is a PDF. You just click on it, and there you go.
So I will share this. I'll share this in the show notes. So if you get to my website, therootofallsuccess.com, on the show notes for this episode, we'll have a link to the download of the study. How would people connect with you? Is there a space online that they could connect and reach out to you?
They can drop me an email. That's always the easiest.
And what is that email?
Yeah, I can also send it to you. Yeah.
All right. We'll put it in, because it may be hard to understand when we just read it out. So we'll put it in the show notes to reach out to Sasha, Dr. Sasha Becker. And you know what? You sent me a note today pre-show that there was a study, or not a study, but an article written today in the Finance Review. Is that right? About your study? And it was published on LinkedIn.
Yeah, there is
today.
A blog post that summarizes things in a even shorter way than reading the whole study. Yeah, so that we can also share. And then your listeners can take whatever they like.
Well, that's good, because they can connect with you on LinkedIn and follow what's going on with that. So, Sasha, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been an honor, and I know that I hope that at the end of the day that all of the technical stuff that you and I've been dealing with doesn't make it into the final cut of the show. But if we did have a little hiccups here and there with the audio, and I don't know, blame it on COVID. Everybody blames everything on COVID anyway, I guess, but I'm just kidding. But thank you for being on the show. Thank you for being here. And thank you for letting me talk to you, because I know we didn't know each other. I just reached out to you cold, and you came on the show, and I'm very appreciative. So thank you for being on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, normally at this point, I would say there you have it, another very successful entrepreneur and his or her story about success. Well, that's not what we talked about today, as you clearly see. So what's the moral of all this? Why did I bring Dr. Sasha Becker onto the show to talk about the deaths of startup founders in Norway? Here's the thing. For those of you that follow any of my content on a regular basis, you know that I'm the exit guy. I teach people how to exit without exiting. I teach entrepreneurs how to live the exit lifestyle. And the reason I do it is because I was able to accomplish that and fulfill my passions, and to be able to go on and build more companies and make more impact in the world. And I did it in a way that allowed my company to thrive in my absence. Now, that doesn't make me special or smarter. I just did it intentionally. And what Sasha and his team discovered in this study is that when a founder exits the company, now he was studying when they exit by death, but when a founder exits the company, suddenly there's a significant drop in the ability for that company to continue to live, to the tune of 60% drop, persistent and permanent drop in sales, and as high as we studied saw in the U.S. study, 53% drop in profitability. Now you may say, well, that's fine. I'm not planning on dying. Well, nobody's planning on dying, but you might. But what if you decide one day you want to just exit the daily operations and you don't plan for it? Your company will not thrive. That's what this study proves, is that you have to prepare for the inevitable detachment of you as the founder from the company. I loved what Sasha talked about, the fact that many entrepreneurs build their businesses as a conjoined twin, and there's no separation between them and the business. And at some point, if there is a separation, whether by death or by voluntary separation, that the company, sometimes doesn't survive. He also used the analogy of a mother and the baby. And I think that's probably the best one, is that you, as the entrepreneur, as the founder, you have to make sure that you're letting your baby grow and learn to walk on his own. You've got to make sure that baby, that child, your baby, the company, can walk on its own. Because if you carry it around all the time because you're stronger, better, smarter, and you know more, it's never going to sustain that baby's life. It will always require you to be there to be its caretaker. And then in the event that you're not able to be there as a caretaker through sickness or death, your company suffers. So you really need to put this into perspective. Your desire as the entrepreneur to stay in the center of your business is selfish. You don't intend to be selfish. It's not a willful selfishness, but nevertheless, the results are the same. Your desire to stay in the center of that business is selfish. Why? Because if you have any number of employees who depend upon your company to provide them income to support their families, imagine what would happen if the company's income dropped by 60% permanently. Would you be able to keep all those people employed? Would you be able to pay them bonuses? Would you be able to give them time off and benefits? The answer to that is almost assuredly no. But that's what, in fact, would happen if you were to leave unexpectedly through death or some other long protracted illness. So don't be selfish. Learn how to exit. Learn how to get out of the way. And you don't have to exit the company. You don't have to sell it, but there is a way that you can prepare for it. And now I realize that a lot of you listening to this right now, you're going to think, well, this was totally self-serving. You're just trying to sell a course. Well, you can say that. And indeed, there is an ability for me to draw a direct connection between what I do every day and what we just talked about on the show. But there is a reason that I brought this up. My mission in life is to help people like you get the results that you want. And the results that you want a thriving, growing business. And the reality is a thriving, growing business should be able to thrive and grow on its own without you at the center of the helm, carrying that baby everywhere it goes. So to that end, I designed something called the Exit Accelerator. And the Exit Accelerator is a 12-week live group coaching platform where I take entrepreneurs just like you through the 4 steps that I learned and I executed to exit without exiting, to get out of the weeds, to let my company continue to thrive even in my absence. Now, for me, I wanted to be completely disconnected from all daily operations, and I have been able to successfully do that. But for you, it might be, listen, I don't want to exit the daily operations. That's fine. But learning how to exit without exiting will allow you to disconnect yourself from the center of the business. You can still stay involved. You can still be in charge, but you've got to let that baby walk on its own. If you're interested or curious at all about what Exit Without Exiting is and how to accomplish it, go to my website, exitwithoutexiting.com. That's exitwithoutexiting.com. And take a look at that Exit Accelerator. It's a cohort model. In other words, we get no more than 12 people and we stay together for those 12 weeks and we go through the curriculum, the course together. You're going to meet entrepreneurs from all over the world, and you're going to hear how they are dealing with how to extract themselves from the daily operations of their business so that it can survive on its own, even in your absence. whether you want to exit at 100% and get out of the way, whether you want to sell it, whether you want to just kind of take a little bit of break from running the day-to-day. This course, the Exit Accelerator, will help you do that. It will absolutely change your life. Go to exitwithoutexiting.com and take a look at it. Now, I've got a special offer for you. If you are interested in doing that as a result of hearing my episode here with Dr. Sascha Becker, if you will just DM me the word Becker, because that's easier to spell than the first name, so everybody can remember Becker. If you will just DM me the word Becker, I will give you $500 off the next cohort that you sign up for. So just DM me the word Becker. I'll know what that means. I'll reach back out to you and say, congratulations, you found the keyword, and you can get $500 off the next Exit Accelerator. I'm the real Jason Duncan. That was Sascha Becker. We talked about what happens when entrepreneurs pass away and leave their businesses. And we found out is that it's not good. Businesses suffer irreparable harm when the founder is at the center of the business. So I want you to tune in again next week. I'm going to talk with another very successful entrepreneur like I normally do. And we're going to talk about his or her journey to success. Today was a little interjection of some economic theory and some anecdotal and some empirical evidence based on a longitudinal study that I think you should pay attention to. I'm the real Jason Duncan, and Jesus is King.
Thank you for listening to another edition of The Root of All Success with the real Jason Duncan. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we invite you to visit therootofallsuccess.com to access the show notes and other helpful resources. Take charge of your business. Grow it from great to incredible. Join us again next time here on The Root of All Success.